Konami loves adding older banned card effects to newer cards that have more restrictions. Pot of the Forbidden has 4 different possible effects. You can either use a Pot of Greed type effect, a Giant Trunade effect, a Regeki effect, or a Forceful Sentry effect. Triple Tactics Talent is basically Change of Heart plus Pot of Greed plus the Forceful Sentry, and there are plenty of other examples. I'm sure you guys can think of a lot of them. I will say here that not all of these newer cards that are mimicking older cards age quite as well as others, because one thing that has happened multiple times is that the older card gets unbanned eventually, and then the cards that were mimicking their effects become a lot less relevant. But overall, I think this is a pretty cool way to reinvent older banned card effects, and I think Konami does a pretty good job with this. Personally, I really like the Elemental Lord cards. These were released starting back all the way in 2012, and they mimic banned card effects, but they put a lot of restrictions on their summoning requirement. I thought this was a really interesting idea back when they were first revealed, and even nowadays I think they're pretty cool. And while nowadays we have the Element Sabers around to help us summon these cards a lot easier, I think it was way more interesting when those cards didn't exist, and you really had to work to bring out these big monsters. In today's video, I'm going to review all of the Elemental Lord monsters and talk about their history in the Yu-Gi-Oh! Metagame. I think the best way to go about this is to go in chronological order, so we're going to start off by talking about Grand Soil the Elemental Lord, released in Return of the Duelist back in August of 2012. This is a level 8 Earth Beast Warrior effect monster with 2800 attack and 2200 defense. It says, cannot be normal summoned or set, must be special summoned from your hand by having exactly 5 earth monsters in your graveyard. When this card is special summoned, you can target one monster in either player's graveyard, special summon that target. You can only use this effect of Grand Soil the Elemental Lord once per turn. If this face-up card leaves the field, skip the battle phase of your next turn. Notably, when this card was first released, it did not have that hard once per turn restriction. However, we'll talk about that in a moment, because I do want to mention here that almost immediately, this card saw competitive play. Jeff Jones was able to get second place at YCS Toronto in September of 2012 using a deck called Grand Soil Psychics. It used 3 copies of Grand Soil alongside a bunch of great earth monsters, including powerful psychics like Serene Psychic Witch. Jeff Jones has always been known for taking innovative decks to competitions and doing well with them, and this deck was no exception. It pretty much blew everyone away, and while it never became a widespread meta contender, it was a deck that would continue to see experimentation throughout the next few years. It did manage to get another regional top a year later as well, but in general, besides that, Grand Soil did see play in a number of Earth decks that topped regionals and YCSs. Grand Soil was a card that was played on and off throughout the years up until about 2014, and then it didn't really see play until 2017 at YCS Toronto. Yes, we're back at another YCS Toronto with Grand Soil, and this time it was being used in a Dinosaur FTK deck that would use Phantom Fortress to banish every single card in your opponent's deck on turn 1. This deck managed to make top 32 at that YCS. Basically, he would abuse Grand Soil in combination with 3 copies of Firewall Dragon to summon an infinite number of Phantom Fortresses to banish every single card in his opponent's deck. That combo ended up getting Grand Soil banned, but Konami decided to change its effect to a hard once per turn, and then they unbanned it, so now it's been in the game for quite a while without causing any issues. All in all, Grand Soil is a great Elemental Lord. It saw a ton of play throughout the years, and it was even good enough to get banned at one point. Up next, we have Moulin Glacia, the Elemental Lord, a level 8 Water Sea Serpent effect monster with 2800 attack and 2200 defense. This card was released in Abyss Rising in November of 2012. This card says it cannot be normal summoned or set, must be special summoned from your hand by having exactly 5 water monsters in your graveyard. If this card is special summoned, discard 2 random cards from your opponent's hand, or their entire hand if less than 2. You can only use this effect of Moulin Glacia, the Elemental Lord, once per turn. If this face-up card leaves the field, skip the battle phase of your next turn. Now, as you guys probably can guess, this is a copy of the old Delinquent Duo card, but Moulin Glacia actually is a bit better because with Delinquent Duo, your opponent got to choose one of the cards. With Moulin Glacia, though, both of the cards are random, which gives you a higher chance to hit 2 good cards. Chances are, if you've played against a Mermail deck ever, you've probably seen Moulin Glacia summoned. Moulin Glacia is great in Mermails. It was basically a staple one of immediately when it was released because Atlantean Dragoons can add it right to your hand. This is a significant advantage over other Elemental Lord cards because you don't have to play multiple copies of this card. You usually don't even have to have it in your hand unless you know you are summoning it. Now, I will mention here that when Element Sabers were released, all of the Elemental Lords became a lot more searchable. Notably, though, the Element Saber cards did not perform very well in the TCG, while Moulin Glacia still continues to see play even in 2021. So I would say that Moulin Glacia is probably the most successful Elemental Lord monster. I know Grand Soil saw a lot of play as well, and it even got banned, but it got banned more for being abused by Firewall Dragon, while Moulin Glacia has seen continued success throughout the last 9 years. Next up, we have Pyro Rex, the Elemental Lord, released in Cosmo Blazer in January of 2013. This is a level 8 Fire Dinosaur effect monster with, you guessed it, 2800 attack and 2200 defense. It says cannot be normal summoned or set, must be special summoned from your hand by having exactly 5 fire monsters in your graveyard. When this card is special summoned, you can target one monster your opponent controls, destroy it, and if you do, both players take damage equal to half the original attack of the destroyed monster. You can only use this effect of Pyro Rex, the Elemental Lord, once per turn. If this face-up card leaves the field, skip the battle phase of your next turn. So basically, this is a worse Ring of Destruction. I will say it's very on theme for a fire monster to copy Ring of Destruction's effect, because Ring of Destruction obviously has a lot of fire in the artwork. Unfortunately, despite a number of good fire decks existing around this time period in Yu-Gi-Oh's history, Pyro Rex really never saw competitive play. It's not a very good going first card, and there were better going second cards even back in 2013, so this card never really made it to the top tables. It's not a terrible card, and it could win games, but compared to the other fire support in the game, Pyro Rex was a bit too situational, and it didn't have enough of a payoff. Still a cool card, still a card that's very on theme for its attribute, but it's never been quite good enough to see competitive play. Then in Lord of the Tachyon Galaxy in March of 2013, we got Windrose, the Elemental Lord. Now keep in mind here, in Lord of the Tachyon Galaxy, we had some very powerful cards, such as the Dragon Rulers and Spellbook of Judgment. So this card had a lot of competition. Windrose is a level 8 winged beast monster with 2800 attack and 2200 defense. It says cannot be normal summoned or set, must be special summoned from your hand by having exactly 5 wind monsters in your graveyard. If this card is special summoned, destroy all spells and traps your opponent controls. You can only use this effect of Windrose, the Elemental Lord, once per turn. If this face-up card leaves the field, skip the battle phase of your next turn. Windrose is a Harpy's Feather Duster, which is very good in theory, and it is pretty on theme with the wind attribute, but unfortunately, compared to the other cards released in that time period, Windrose was very outclassed. I will say that Windrose isn't terrible, and I think Element Saber decks do play one copy of it, either in the main or side deck, because it is a searchable Harpy's Feather Duster, but in terms of actual competitive play, Windrose flopped pretty hard. Maybe not quite as bad as Pyro Rex did, but it's still not a very good monster. For the longest time, people thought that Konami would never release a light or dark Elemental Lord. However, in Flames of Destruction in March of 2018, we finally got the Element Saber archetype, and Konami gave us a new Elemental Lord monster. This one was Phosphorage, the Elemental Lord, a light fairy level 8 effect monster with 2800 attack and 2200 defense. This card cannot be normal summoned or set. It must be special summoned from your hand by having exactly 5 light monsters in your graveyard. When this card is special summoned, you can destroy all monsters your opponent controls. You can only use this effect of Phosphorage the Elemental Lord once per turn. If this face-up card leaves the field, skip the battle phase of your next turn. It's not that a Raigeki type effect was bad necessarily, but by 2018 standards, this card was pretty outdated, even considering that you could add it to your hand pretty easily in an Element Saber deck. And then in 2018, we got our Dark Elemental Lord monster. This is a Dark level 8 Fiend effect monster with 2800 attack and 2200 defense. It cannot be normal summoned or set, must be special summoned from your hand by having exactly 5 Dark monsters in your graveyard. If this card is special summoned, add 1 monster with 1500 or less attack from your deck to your hand. You can only use this effect of Umbra Mirage the Elemental Lord once per turn. If this face-up card leaves the field, skip the battle phase of your next turn. Umbra Mirage copies Last Will, a very powerful spell card that's been banned for a long time. However, this card really hasn't seen competitive play, which is a bit surprising in my opinion, because I do feel like this card isn't terrible. Last Will is a very good spell card, and there are a lot of dark decks out there. The main problem with this card, and a lot of the Elemental Lords in modern Yu-Gi-Oh! At least, is that the main deck that you would play to summon them in would be Element Sabers, because they're searchable in that deck, and Element Sabers are not very good. Dark Spirit's Mastery is probably one of the best ways to add this card to your hand if you are not playing an Element Saber deck, but the problem there is that with Atlantean Dragoons, Moulin Glacia is a search target, but it's not the only search target in your deck. You have a bunch of other Sea Serpents that you could add. With Dark Spirit's Mastery, you would need other level 8 monsters to add to your hand that are good in different situations. That's what made Moulin Glacia so powerful, was that if you didn't have a combo that could put 5 waters in the grave, you didn't have to search the Moulin Glacia. The problem with making a deck that played 3 copies of this Elemental Lord plus 3 copies of Dark Spirit's Mastery is that you would have a lot of potential bricks. But maybe in the future, if we got a good dark deck that played other level 8 Fiend monsters, you could play 1 copy of this card to search out with Dark Spirit's Mastery. That could be pretty cool, but for now, this card is not very competitive, and I don't think it'll be competitive for quite a while. But I do think there is a lot of potential with this card. Anyway, that is all for today's video. I hope you guys enjoyed it. I'll see you later. Thanks so much for watching. Goodbye.